Policy making is, at the end of the day, making very nuanced choices. And from what we heard from Professor on the first day from Asim Khwaja, these needs to be contextualized in country, but also contextualized in time. And as we were having these two discussions, first with His Excellency Jose Campo and then with Professor Jack Liu, we saw how we need to be aware about the consequences, but many times we are going to make these decisions under uncertain situations. And what is more important is that we are ready for course corrections. So from those fascinating discussions, now we are going to move back to the sessions, and now we have the session 9 on journalism and taxation. And to moderate the discussion, I'm inviting Anya, and I give the floor to Anya to introduce the other panelists. Anya, the floor is yours.
Thank you. This session will be a little shorter as my husband stole half an hour from me. Very glad to be here. Will Fitzgibbon and Jesse Drucker will be joining us, and they are two journalists who've probably done more to cover tax avoidance than most of the journalists in the world. Jesse has a very long resume of years at the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg. He's writing a book at the moment on tax avoidance. He was one of the main investigators on the Trump family and has produced incredible coverage on that. To my happiness, I discovered last week that my father published his father's books, so we even have a family connection. Will Fitzgibbon has been at the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists, I think since 2014. I'm looking at Will. He's done remarkable work on some of the biggest stories of our time: Panama Papers, Paradise Papers, Uber files, implant files. And the ICIJ has really kind of revolutionized journalism by doing cross-border investigative reporting and bringing together hundreds of journalists from around the world, including in the Global South, to work together on massive databases created by the leaks that they get. Their work involves having these different outlets publish on the same day, and therefore they have an enormous impact. They get a lot of attention, and in many of your countries, government officials have had to resign after being exposed for being tax avoiders. Much of it's legal, but it's still naming and shaming. In the studies that we've done at Columbia on the effect of tax campaigns, we found that ICIJ has really been able to get more attention and more impact even than many of the NGOs' campaigns. But I think that the role of the journalism is very important above and beyond impact. I think what journalists do is they frame the discussion, they keep the problem at the top of mind, it puts pressure on regulators, and they also are able to amplify the work that regulators do or prosecutors do, and they distill and translate. So they take what seems like a sort of complicated subject and then explain to the general public why it's so important. So on the ICIJ website, when they exposed the Panama Papers, they also explained what effect that had on healthcare in Uganda. You know, this fits very well with what Professor O'Hare was talking about 2 days ago, about the sort of human cost of tax avoidance and what happens when that money isn't collected. So I'd like to welcome Jesse and Will to the front of the room, and we'll be hearing first from Jesse and then from Will, and there'll be time for a few questions, although I know we have not as much time as planned because you all have a coffee break after.
Yeah. Jesse, why don't you start talking to us a little bit about the work you've been doing in your book, and make sure you put the microphone close to your mouth so that we can hear you. Thank you very much.
Now? Thanks for having me. So I was going to talk a little bit about the impact that journalism can actually have on tax policy and the debates around taxes by doing something that I'm not used to doing, which is actually taking some credit for something that I've written actually having an impact on something. So just by way of background, I first started writing about taxes at the Wall Street Journal back in 2006 and moved to Bloomberg in 2009. And when I moved to Bloomberg as a member of their new investigations team, I proposed to the editors there that I spend a lot of time digging into something that they had never heard of and that most people had never heard of, called transfer pricing. And the reason I proposed that was because I had written about taxes for several years at the Journal at that time. Transfer pricing seemed like an opaque part of the tax law, but a part of the tax law and the tax reality that numerous tax professionals, tax lawyers, described to me consistently as fiction. This was the word that people in the practice of advising multinational companies on their taxes, they themselves use that term to describe transfer pricing. I remember one attorney, a very prominent international tax attorney, when I told him what I was doing, he said, "You understand you are entering a fictional world." And so I started digging into companies in 2009, and what I figured I would do was start to look, so I assume everyone here has some basic understanding of transfer pricing, but to the degree that you don't, it's the way that companies are required to allocate their profits between subsidiaries around the world to figure out how much should be taxed where. And this is done through a series of literally fictional transactions, theoretical transactions that go on between their subsidiaries.
I'll just say that when I was at Columbia Business School, we were taught how to do this.
And so I had sort of a general understanding that U.S. companies made extensive use of their subsidiaries in Ireland to manage their tax bills, to take advantage of Ireland's low tax rate of 12.5%. And what I expected to find at the beginning of this project was that companies were shifting profits into Ireland and cutting their tax bills that way. And what I eventually discovered was that wasn't exactly what was happening. What was happening was much more significant than that. And I first began to look at, I created a spreadsheet, or I had a younger person create the spreadsheet because my skills, I was not capable of doing that, where we downloaded data from companies' SEC filings. Companies' tax footnotes in their securities filings are to some degree opaque, but they're not totally opaque. They're actually quite useful if you know how to look at them. And what I started looking for was for companies that had big discrepancies between where they were reporting their real-world sales, like the actual sales that are happening in the real world, and where they were claiming their pre-tax income was taking place, right? So you've got a lot of sales in one place, but you're not reporting a lot of income there. I figured that would be an interesting clue to a company that's worth looking at. And so I eventually settled on a company called Forest Laboratories. And Forest Laboratories has since been, I actually can't even keep track now. There was sort of a wave of M&A activity in the pharma industry, and Forest Laboratories is actually now owned by another drug company, and I'm blanking on the name. But at the time, Forest Laboratories, to the degree that anyone had ever heard of it, was because it was responsible for a very successful antidepressant called Lexapro. And what I found was that although Forest's top product, Lexapro, was sold only in the US, Forest did not sell Lexapro, its blockbuster antidepressant, anywhere else in the world, it was claiming that the majority of its profits were outside the US. And to kind of cut to the chase here, by looking through a series of filings, first in Ireland, and then Bermuda, and then the Netherlands, I figured out that what was happening was Forest was, in fact, shifting profits into Ireland, which is what I expected to find. But then I found there was this additional step of shifting profits out of Ireland through the Netherlands into Bermuda, where they were not taxed at all. And I discovered the same phenomena with Google. I discovered the same phenomena with Facebook. And some of you may remember these are the transactions that go by the nickname the double Irish and the Dutch sandwich. And these articles were published in 2010. And I would say that for the next couple of years, nothing really happened. There was no real response. I think what really changed this was in 2012, actually it's possible it's 2013, I'm a little embarrassed that might have the year wrong. Tom Bergen, a journalist, an excellent journalist at Reuters, wrote a series of articles that I think probably were the biggest, I think is probably the kind of highest impact journalism that anyone's ever done on corporate taxes. And I think the thing that really resonated was he looked at Starbucks, and Tom is based in London, and what he discovered was that for the past decade, Starbucks was telling its investors on conference calls how wildly profitable it was in the UK, but for tax purposes, it was claiming not to earn any profit in the UK at all. And he found that over the last 10 years, they had reported paying almost no income taxes in the UK, and I think over the previous 3 years had reported not a dime or a pence in income taxes in that period. And so he did a similar story in Amazon. Eventually, the UK Parliament in early 2013 did some hearings on this, where a member of Parliament memorably called the representatives from the companies, Google, Amazon, the third company, who I'm forgetting right now, she called them immoral. And so this, I think, contributed to kicking off the OECD's BEPS project, which is now, and I guess about to enter year 10 or 2013 we're about to enter its 10th year. And in the US, there was some journalism on Apple and some other US multinationals. Senator Levin held hearings on Apple and Hewlett-Packard and other companies. And despite that, you see, I think, a very interesting split in the reaction, which is in Europe and outside the US, you see quite a bit of legislative activity, both in terms of hearings, in terms of proposed taxes. I think right around either just before the BEPS process began or shortly after, Italy introduced what people referred to as a Google tax, where they were basically going to go after this unilaterally. But in the US, you saw really nothing. And in fact, more than nothing, I think the US in the BEPS process has probably been the country that's been the leading obstacle to some of the proposals in the BEPS process. And in some ways, I think the analysis of this is pretty simple. It's one thing to be in the UK or France or Italy and Japan, and a US multinational is coming into your country and earning profits and not paying any taxes to your country. That's a much easier political target to go after essentially a foreign company coming into your country than for the US to go after a US company that actually is paying billions of dollars in income taxes in the US. So, I'm sorry, and then one other piece of this, I think, that's not really a journalism issue, but more of a policy issue, is that for reasons that I still don't entirely understand, in Europe, and particularly in the UK, you've had the rise of a very significant series of NGOs, like the Tax Justice Network, and kind of take your pick of long-established NGOs that have done pretty significant work on tax dodging by multinationals. And again, for reasons I don't entirely understand, that hasn't really happened here in the US. I can understand why the politicians and regulators aren't going after the companies. I don't really understand why we haven't had the similar rise of NGOs or even the existing nonprofits like the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, the existing nonprofits that focus on taxes, taking up this issue. I don't have a theory as to why that hasn't happened. So the last thing that I want to say on this, both kind of around policy and around journalism, is that you basically have had the BEPS process kind of fumble along for 10 years now. And then something very interesting happens, which is in 2017, the Republicans ram through, without any hearings or any discussion, the biggest changes to the international tax laws in the history of the income tax here in the US. And on net, the TCJA is a historic giveaway to the wealthiest people in the country, but it did contain the kernel of something that had been debated for essentially 5 or 6 years at that point, which is a minimum tax on the offshore earnings of US multinationals. But that said, I think it is striking, and again, I don't really have a theory as to why this is, you know, we're now approaching the 5-year anniversary of the biggest overhaul to the US tax code in 31 years. And the journalism on the aftermath of those changes here in the US is kind of non-existent. I mean, there really isn't. There was a flurry of stories around the time of the legislation, and there really has been very little in the way of looking at what actually has happened with the guilty or with the beat or Section 199A, which again is sort of a historic giveaway to partnerships in the real estate sector that's now been in the law for 5 years. And again, I don't really have a theory as to why that is, but I think it's significant. So I will say in summation, the thing about multinational profit shifting that I think that's interesting and somewhat unique is that it sort of shows sort of the best and the worst of sort of the way politics and civil society can react to these big problems, and how in some ways it really comes down to I don't want to say impure motives, but in some ways you can kind of boil it down to the fact that the rest of the US is very comfortable attacking US multinationals, and the US, including the NGO community, the journalism world, seems less comfortable in taking on an issue that is kind of primarily driven by US companies. So that's it. I do hope that we can have a long discussion about this, so I don't know if...
I mean, I think you're making a really important point, which is that journalists, of course, job is to do journalism and not to get involved with advocacy campaigns, but that I think when we look throughout history, and that's been the subject of some of my research, the journalism makes a difference when there's also political will and an NGO community and accountable entities. And so I think you've highlighted the lack of NGOs in the US around this, but we also do have these entities that are not accountable, which are the large multinational corporations, and a government that is very much captured by campaign finance donations. So I think that's part of why we don't have the political will. I think there is probably the popular support. So I think, yeah, your points are really important. I guess, Will, you'll be talking to us a little bit more about the international perspective on this. Thank you.
Yes, I will. Thank you very much. Hi, everyone. And I'm glad that I've at least succeeded in one thing today, which is making you all feel more comfortable that you're better dressed for the occasion than I am. I think I win the award for casual attendee of the day. Very pleased to be here, really to stand on the shoulders of people like Jesse, which is not to age you, Jesse, and to stand on the shoulders of organizations I know are in the room, like Tax Justice Network Africa, and many others. And really talk about how it is from a global perspective, in my experience, that hundreds or thousands of journalists went from running as fast as they could away from the word tax and reporting on tax, to now I think what we've seen over the past 5 or 7 years, to tax matters becoming a subject that journalists, really no matter the country they live in and no matter their level of comfort with spreadsheets and annual reports from corporations, feel as though it's something they can report on. So I work for ICIJ, probably better known as the Panama Papers people, for example, depending on how long ago your memory is. And I've been there since 2014 now, which is a little bit after actually ICIJ first started reporting on issues of tax havens, tax avoidance, tax evasion, and more generally illicit financial flows. And I always start with that historical sweep because I do think it's important, the fact that when ICIJ first published its initial 2013 investigation, which was based on our first mass leak of offshore documents, that was, it was big. It was the biggest cross-border investigation of journalists at the time. It was, I think, journalists from 58 countries, more than 100 reporters. And that was influential. That was called Offshore Leaks or Secrecy for Sale at the time. That was an investigation that led to the European Parliament responding, a whole number of governments responding, the Indian Tax Authority conducting raids, etc. And yet now I look back on that investigation and think, my oh my, 100 reporters working together, what a quaint idea. Because the Pandora Papers investigation, which we published last year, involved more than 600 reporters in countries, in journalists working in, I think, more than 100 countries. And I think that growth speaks to a few things, but primarily speaks to the interest that we've seen among journalists in writing about tax-related matters, in writing about financial secrecy, and in writing about these kind of topics that we're talking about here. And I don't think that would have been the case worldwide 5 or 10 years ago. And we've seen a growth in that interest among journalists, I think largely because we've seen impacts from investigative journalism in the tax world. Are those impacts the ones that we would expect to see, or that should be seen from a public interest point of view? No. There are lots of people who I've read private emails of who've definitely committed crimes, who are still representing people in Parliament or in the Senate in many countries, including probably some of yours around the world. But we have seen incredible impacts from these series of investigations. And let's be honest, journalists are not saints. I'm sure none of you think we are. And there is a virtuous circle of investigative reporting leading to impact, leading to more investigative reporting. As of last count, I believe, governments around the world had acknowledged recouping more than $1.36 billion in taxes and tax penalties from ICIJ-led investigations, the Panama Papers, Swiss Leaks, for those of you who remember that, the Paradise Papers, and others. And these are from countries that range from Malta to New Zealand to India. Other impacts that we can talk about is in Colombia, for example. I still remember being struck by this amazing research out of Colombia in 2018, I believe, that showed that there was a 830% increase in the disclosures by Colombian nationals of offshore assets after the Panama Papers investigation. Such was the power of that investigative reporting, such was that fear among high net worth individuals that they didn't want to be on the front page of Jesse's newspaper or of Colombian newspapers, or they didn't want to be named and shamed as part of the next upcoming ICIJ investigation, that they voluntarily threw everything that they had at the Colombian tax office and disclosed that. And we've seen that in example around the world. Beyond financial recovery, of course, from governments, we've seen a string of criminal investigations for tax evasion and for other crimes around the world, including in the United States, although that did take a lot longer than some other countries. And I think importantly, have also seen a series of legislative changes following the fact that governments have realized after the reporting by investigative reporters that there are huge loopholes enabling high net worth individuals and companies to really, if not create the rules that they play by, then to identify and abuse the loopholes that are already created for them. We've seen legislative reform in places like New Zealand, as well as Panama, the United Kingdom, when it came to enablers, for example. Let alone the European Union, which I know I've heard the European Union in the past refer to ICIJ as kind of as one of its branches of investigative agencies, basically. There does seem to be this sometimes flattering, sometimes disturbing call and response relationship between ICIJ and the EU or the EU Parliament, where an ICIJ investigation will come out, and then like clockwork, members of Parliament at the EU level will announce an investigation or publish a resolution, which is great in some ways, but I think also is an issue that we as journalists continue to monitor. We were talking recently with Anya, for example, about fatigue, tax fatigue, investigative expose fatigue. I won't blame any of you in this room if you rolled your eyes a little more at the Pandora Papers revelations than you did the Panama Papers revelations, for example. I know lots of people do. I know taxi drivers I've been in cars with certainly do. Always asking me, what the heck happened after the Panama Papers, or what the heck happened after the Pandora Papers? And I think journalism, despite its improvements over years in telling stories about tax and in showing problems and in leading to impacts, still has more work to do in making the case and in staying on top of these topics, which is difficult. journalism, measuring the impact of investigative journalism, or journalism generally, is a dangerous and tricky thing, and I've tried to give you a few examples of why I think we can, as a result of investigations that have been published in recent years. But I also think that something I take away from my years at ICIJ is that a lot of the impact from the kind of reporting that Jesse's done, that a lot of the impact from advocacy that groups like TJN have done and from ICIJ investigations actually can't always be measured in money that is returned to a treasury or in a new bill that's passed in Parliament. I think that lots of the impact of, at a global level, of investigations like the Panama Papers or the Paradise Papers is what I call the water cooler impact. That is, it blows my mind to think now that tax evasion or tax avoidance is a concept that is discussed by thousands of journalists working in Niger, West Africa, to Paraguay, to East Timor, to Kazakhstan, in a way that simply didn't exist previously. And that not only are journalists more comfortable and familiar in reporting about those topics, but that's leading to discussions on these tax topics by taxi drivers in cities in Chad, for example. You know, people know, for better or for worse, and I happen to think it's for the better, that by association, the British Virgin Islands, or South Dakota for that matter, have a bit of a dodgy smell about them. That these are places where, for the average man, woman, or person on the street, when you hear that geographical location in association with a minister or a corporation, that it's legitimate and reasonable to raise your eyebrows. And I think that kind of water cooler talk around taxation and tax fairness is a huge impact, albeit one that's kind of impossible or very difficult to measure. And I might stop there.
Is this working? Yeah. I guess I also want to point out that these investigations are very expensive. They take a huge amount of time. They take a lot of money. And they can be very dangerous in countries that don't respect free expression or that persecute journalists. So there's an enormous personal risk to covering the rich and powerful and exposing their secrets. So I think that part of what we need to do to encourage the journalism is A, to make sure it's funded, and B, to make sure that governments are respecting the right of journalists to do their work and not just suing them for defamation or shutting them down or buying them out when they do this kind of reporting too. Yeah, I didn't know, Jesse, if you wanted to come in and add anything or respond to Will.
Well, I mean, one thing that you said that resonated with me, well, the expense part is resonating with me now because I'm on unpaid book leave, so all of the expenses associated with my reporting come out of my own pocket. But one thing that you said that is interesting is I did a story just before I left this summer on kind of the conflict of interest within Big Four accounting firms between the auditing function and the tax advice function. And in the course of reporting that, came across some, I don't actually remember the details, but there were some tax dodges by some particular multinationals that had ever been reported on. And I asked my editor, I said, well, should we consider pivoting and instead of focusing on the accounting firms, do a story on these tax dodges, or do people kind of already know this? And he said, people already know this. So in other words, I think that a decade ago, it was not kind of banked into people's consciousness that, oh yes, multinationals shift trillions of dollars of profits into Bermuda and the Cayman Islands and the BVI. I think now that's understood. So in some ways, you could argue that it's the kind of the onus for action has shifted from the journalists to the rest of civil society, to the regulatory agencies, the legislatures, and the NGOs to some degree. So that's one thought.
That's definitely something that we still experience a lot within ICIJ, is how do we tell these stories about taxation in a way that's going to continue to generate interest? And I think focusing on enablers like the PwCs of this world has helped in some cases. I think focusing on emerging tax haven jurisdictions has helped garner new interest, at least globally. in places. You know, why is it that Brazilian, Colombian, Venezuelan, and Mexican billionaires are now setting up trusts in South Dakota or Wyoming, for example, deregistering those trusts in places like the British Virgin Islands or Jersey? I think these kind of new themes help reporters stay hungry, and they help editors, at least in some newspapers, remain willing to publish stories. But it is a challenge, I think. You know, as journalists have covered this topic more and more, the users of these structures and the beneficiaries of tax avoidance and tax evasion have also got savvier. You know, in Kenya, for example, with the Pandora Papers, there was documented evidence that the former president of Kenya at the time, Uhuru Kenyatta, had a beneficial interest in a foundation in Panama, for example. That story was published. Kenyatta at the time denied that his name was in the Pandora Papers. It definitely was. But I thought it was interesting in what we saw, in which there was a huge astroturfing online campaign to not discredit the reporting, but to play it down and say, he's a wealthy person, it's not illegal to have done what he did, therefore journalists shouldn't be paying attention to it. And I think that's an area that we're seeing emerging within the reporting space, at least globally. That kind of more nuanced response to investigative journalism on the tax space that is going to force reporters to become even more learned, I suppose, about the intricacies in a way that Jesse is, but in a way that 99% of journalists aren't yet.
Is this working? Yeah. Things like filming and movies, the laundromat can come into play. Journalists are always trying to find new ways of getting attention for these stories that really have been the same stories for hundreds of years. And so now experimenting with video, film. I know that Bellingcat, I think, has set up a film production company. Netflix has been buying journalism stories in Europe because they need to have local content. So that's another attempt to sort of, spread the word. But I agree that the fatigue problem is real. What would the audience like to ask questions? We have a mic here. I see a question right there.
Thank you. I have a question for both Jesse and Will. I wonder if you're aware, and if so, what you think of the subaltern relationship that exists between the media in developing countries and prestigious outlets like the ones you work for, and what do you think is the best way to handle it, use it for the better, right? By the way, I'm the director of the Colombian Tax Administration, and 4 months ago, I was a university professor with a column in a national newspaper, and I've seen the way these dynamics work, right? You can say whatever you want in your local column or your local outlet, but if you manage to publish an op-ed in the New York Times or in The Economist or whatever, it has this disproportionate impact on public opinion in your country. I've never seen the American public agonizing over something that Le Monde reported in France or anything that El Espectador reported in Colombia, but I have seen, and I thought it was a little bit silly, but it happened, high-level officials of the Colombian government traveled to New York to talk to the New York Times editorial board to set the record straight or whatever. So these dynamics exist, and I wonder what do you think the best way to handle them could be?
One thing I do want to point out is that journalists in repressive regimes will very deliberately send news out so that it can be reported overseas, because they know that very often their government won't pay attention to them. And this is why you have so many journalists working for places like, the BBC World Service or Reuters. They're not free in their countries. So I would say that there's a big sort of amplification effect and a bounce back effect where journalists want it to appear in New York, and then that gives them an excuse to publish it again at home. I think one of the really exciting thing, I mean, the subaltern point is obviously a good one, and I think one of the things that Will can talk about is how ICIJ has these equal partnerships with journalists around the world. So, I've been in Namibia, and they're working on the exact same data set that the German journalists are working on, and they're doing it together. And Joe and IPD, got very involved in capacity building of journalists covering economics, globalization, and the extractive sector. We were doing this work about 18 years ago, and we agonized so much about what was the best way to build capacity. There were programs that would send retired journalists to sit in newsrooms for a year or two in Ghana or Kazakhstan. There were a lot of programs like the IIJ in Berlin that would bring journalists out and create networks and sort of work with them in Berlin for a couple months. We had mentors. We really tried everything. Then we'd start, people would start hiring lawyers for the journalists because they would get in trouble. We really tried everything we could to build capacity in those countries. And then I think what Will has done and ICIJ has done has actually been very transformative. Maybe you want to talk a little bit about that relationship.
Yeah, I will a bit, because I think the collaborative nature of investigative reporting is really helping to address those issues that you've identified and that exist around the world. One of the, I think, wonders and the powers of this model of ICIJ's collaborative journalism is to say, it doesn't matter if the one reporter or the team of Colombian reporters gets their story snuffed out by an editor, or if, as it was in Kenya, that no other newspaper picks up that particular story. Because when you've got 600 other reporters working on that, and especially when they're alerted in cases of media restrictions to the fact that a story won't be told, then this network of journalists does a very good job of elevating that story outside of national borders. The minister in Niger, West Africa, or Malawi, for example, is not worried, let's be honest, about the local media in Niger or Malawi. That problem, for various reasons, is taken care of. But they do freak the hell out when that story is published in Le Monde, right? And the biggest impacts we had in places like Francophone West Africa or Central Africa was when these stories were republished by our partners at Le Monde, for example. And in Latin America, I know that our partners try and work closely both regionally in Latin America, but then also with Spanish TV or Spanish news, for example, to ensure those stories get out. So I do think that's a way in which investigative reporting on these topics can push through the walls that exist in national jurisdictions, and we've seen that succeed time and time again.
Well, thank you very much. I work for the Revenue Authority in Zambia. I would like to contribute on the very important aspect that has been raised. First of all, I'd like to applaud the two presenters for the good work. It's really good. But I want to pick up on a point that was mentioned around the weakness in follow-up. And I think there was an issue that was raised. It's a dangerous space. It's expensive and all that. But I just wanted to check whether the fact that you expose these very high-value tax evasion schemes increases the value for you to receive a bribe. For most journalists, I'll take it back home. Most journalists that are doing some semblance of investigative journalism are actually alleged to be on the payrolls of most of these companies that are committing these offenses. So I just wanted to get from your experience whether there's not been any temptation or any attempts by the people affected to reach out to try to grease your hands. Thank you.
I was going to say.
No one's ever tried, so.
Either that or Jesse has the world's largest secret stash of those antidepressant drugs you were talking about. I mean, the reality is, yes, this doesn't happen to me, but I know countless stories after working with journalists on the Panama Papers or Pandora Papers of money or cars or job offers for the journalists' children that they've received from individuals who they're reporting on. I would say once again that the collaborative nature of these investigations make that a lot harder to succeed, because you might well be able to pay off one particular reporter in Zambia, although that hasn't happened to my knowledge, but Will Fitzgibbon in Washington, D.C., or a neighbouring reporter in South Africa or Botswana is also paying attention to that same story. So it becomes a lot harder for information to never see the light of day through these collaborative investigations on tax or illicit financial flow related stories. I mean, I would also make one point, given that we're talking about impact and things. It boggles my mind in this world just how uneven different governments are when it comes to responding to tax-related stories and investigations. You know, why is it that the European Parliament, within 2 hours after the Pandora Papers, releases a statement, whereas the Zambian Revenue Authority or the Malawian Revenue Authority or the Kyrgyz Revenue Authority or their parliaments remain silent on the issue for 6 months, 2 years, 5 years? You know, my dream as a reporter would be that more and more governments around the world react to these investigations, not by disclosing things that they're not legally or ethically allowed to disclose, but contribute in a more constructive way to a global debate on these topics. Because when one government responds, when India raids the home of 1,000 individuals connected to the Panama Papers, or when the government of Ecuador announces that it's holding an investigation into the Pandora Papers revelations, this cycle develops in which reporters follow up on the topic, they understand it's important, and I think a big question mark for me is why isn't that happening in more countries, and how can reporters do a better job working with civil society or reporting on their own stories to try and make sure that more of that visible impact happens?
I mean, I just had one other thought listening to Will that doesn't really respond to your question, which is, and I don't really have a theory as to why this is, but I would like to point out something that's maybe not as obvious. It's not just, you know, when I write these articles, you would expect, say, Elizabeth Warren or Bernie Sanders or, you know, even better, the chair of the Senate Finance Committee or the chair of the House Ways and Means Committee to hold a hearing or propose legislation. Doesn't happen. I mean, I wrote a story a little over a year ago about the revolving door between the big four accounting firms and the Office of Tax Policy at the U.S. Treasury Department. Elizabeth Warren and another rep, whose name I'm blanking on right now, to their credit, wrote some letters to the Treasury Department's Inspector General, and that was it. And I don't have a theory as to why that is. You would think these are natural issues for some of those politicians I just named, but you know, if they're doing stuff in response to some of the things I've written, I haven't seen it. So
hi, yes, my name is Daniel Jimenez. I'm with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Norway, and thank you very much for your presentations. I think just the impact of your reporting in Norway and the Nordic countries cannot really be understated when it comes to moving especially the civil society, which then again has had a big impact on policy development in this area the last 5-10 years. Also with the background of the political culture of wanting and expecting transparency, obviously it's a good fertile ground for that kind of reporting. One of the things I was wondering in terms of the timing of your leaks and the stories that come, and sometimes it's been very timely and it's been matched really well to current events, right? When you have political figures or high income individuals that basically have had to take had to maybe leave their position of power or other things. In terms of, we've been discussing different angles to taxation here yesterday and the day before, and I was wondering, do you find that there are linkages that are created between your current or former previous reporting, and that journalists are good at using that or recycling or reusing that tied to different angles, like human rights, we're talking about gender equality, we're talking about maybe renewable energy, which obviously a lot of those companies that have complex ownership structures and the potential for leaks exposing that, and also now the war in Europe, in terms of the individuals that, of course, are find the in terms of tax evasion, the sanctions regime, etc. Do you find that there are linkages there, or do you reuse your former reporting and package it differently for the media cycle? Thank you.
Should I respond to that now, or should we take a few more questions and then get back to that? Yes, I think, first of all, thank you very much. I think, secondly, in an ideal world, reporters are constantly digging back into these 40 million documents. The great thing about ICOJ and other organizations, but just speaking for ICOJ, is we now have 40 million plus documents from tax havens around the world spanning 2 decades that reporters who are part of our network and our world can dig into anytime. Jesse regularly, and I enjoy it, flicks me an email and says, hey, Will, do you mind if I can just jump back into the Panama Papers, for example? And reporters are doing that constantly around the world because we know that we're only scratching the surface when we release the Paradise Papers or the Pandora Papers. And my experience is a name that means nothing to me in 2017 might all of a sudden mean a hell of a lot to me in 2021 when it turns out that that person is the nephew of a Russian oligarch and was used as the straw man to purchase a luxury yacht, for example. So these stories that we tell and these resources that we have remain ongoing resources for all the journalists who we work with, and the number of those journalists is increasing by the day and by the week.
Hello. I wonder, thanks for the discussion. I wonder if we need to be more creative in the type of targets we go after. We're sitting here in David Geffen Hall, and I don't know how many people here are aware of David Geffen, but he's a billionaire many times over, and he can use means of reducing his taxes that are not in the same category as, let's say, the Panama Papers would look at. I mean, he's a great art collector, and by donating art, he gets to deduct his taxes in a tremendous way. And here's Henry Kravis all across the way. I mean, that could be another interesting target. And just to finish up, Sam Bankman-Fried. I mean, now everybody is suddenly, oh my goodness, look at what this operation was like. The fact that he was in the Bahamas, to me, was a red flag that he was stationing himself somewhere beyond the reach of US regulators and the like. So here you have these very prominent individuals who, it seems to me, you could get a lot of attention for if you use them as the type of targets you went after.
Thank Michael Massing. He's the founder of the Committee to Protect Journalists and is working on a book right now about inequality. So Michael, thank you very much. I think we can guess the direction your book is going in from those very apposite questions. Maybe Jesse, is that for you as an American?
Well, I'm sorry, Michael, what's the question exactly? I mean, I'm happy to talk about this.
So I think I'll restate the question. So leaks are all very well, and that's very wonderful, but what about closer to home? And I guess probably it's not an either or, right? So I think we've got on the panel a good representation of people working on different aspects of this problem. But Jesse, you're the American.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, again, I'm not entirely sure what the question is, but I mean, I don't really know much about Geffen. I mean, Kravis, I wrote a long article a little over a year ago about private equity. I don't remember if I mentioned Kravis in it or not, actually. It's Steve Schwartzman. But basically the way in which private equity has kind of captured the US tax system, both the legislative process, the regulatory process, and the enforcement process. And another person who you didn't mention, who I included in my article, was sitting up here a little while ago, Jack Lew. I sort of wish he had stuck around to talk about some of these issues because he was the Treasury Secretary during the beginning of the BEPS process. And I would have loved to have heard him talk about the US, the obstacles the US created for that process. And I would have loved to have heard him talk about some of the issues that I raised in my article on private equity, because he didn't return my phone calls when I reached out to him for that story. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is exactly what you're interested in, Michael, but I mean, one thing that is interesting, there was a very interesting thread on Twitter, God help me for saying that, about a year ago by Paul Keel, who's a reporter at ProPublica, and he asked a very interesting question. I can't remember if this was on the heels of maybe the Pandora Papers, I don't remember exactly, but he asked an interesting question, which is, we've had kind of round after round of these leaks, and we almost never see prominent Americans in those leaks. Why is that? And I think part of the reason is, part of the reason, I had a very interesting conversation, I remember, with a tax lawyer about a year ago about the private equity executive who actually got criminally indicted, or he actually, I'm sorry, he didn't, I don't think he's been indicted yet, and I'm blanking on his name. He's on the board of Carnegie Hall. And what the lawyer said to me, which speaks to what Paul said about the lack of Americans in the leaks, is what this lawyer said to me. He said, I don't understand why this guy would commit all these very obvious crimes when I could have done 24 things for him that would have basically gotten him to the same result. And the reality is that if you're a real estate developer here in the US, if you are a private equity executive, I mean, real estate is in a whole other category, right? Which is real estate investors do not pay income taxes. If you're a private equity executive, there's something wrong with your tax advice if you're paying taxes at a rate of kind of half of probably what I pay. So, there are so many planning techniques that you can use in the US to take advantage of our system without having undeclared bank accounts offshore. I mean, that said, obviously, we did have the whole voluntary compliance program in the wake of UBS, where there were enormous numbers of Americans who were coming up to the IRS and fessing up. Yeah, so I don't know if I have anything else to add.
I think that Will can answer that specific question about the Panama Papers, because that had to do with what documents were leaked and what they covered. And then after that, we can close up and have...
In terms of why there were no Americans?
You've had different leaks that have covered different
Right.
parts of the world and different jurisdictions, so it also a little bit depends on where the Americans have stashed their money, right?
Right, that's right. So the 40 million documents that we have from probably about 20 corporate service providers in different tax havens around the world are a snapshot and not representative necessarily of who's doing what in different tax havens. So I think that in some ways reflects the stories we've been able to tell. With 600 reporters, once again, the great thing is it's very hard for one individual to hide. We found the Djibouti reporter does find the one Djiboutian millionaire in the documents, for example, just as the team of American reporters would find Donald Trump if he had happened to be there. Just to go to the leak point, I would make another point, which is, I dream of a world in which leaks are no longer the vehicle through which 600 journalists pay attention to tax stories, for example. There's, as Jesse's reporting proves, and as Jesse mentioned, you could, if you were a Zambian reporter, you could go home this afternoon and look at dozens of annual reports and find all the Mauritius subsidiaries of those mining companies, for example, and use that as a starting point for a tax story. And we're seeing the growth in the capacities of journalists around the world to do that. Largely because many of them have now gotten trainings from Tax Justice Network or different trainings that the Reuters Institute have offered, or because they've worked on ICIJ projects and now their minds are attuned to these kind of things. So my expectation is we'll see more tax-related stories, tax equality-related stories that are not based off leaked documents. Although, let's be honest, journalists kind of love nothing more than working on something in secret for a few months and then being able to tell their wife or their husband, hey, look at me.
Take that
Yeah, thank you.
last question, and then we'll have our coffee break. Thank you very much.
Yes, I have one question, but before I ask that question, I just wanted to make a comment. Once again, I'm Sam Shivute, and I head the Namibia Revenue Agency in Namibia. First, I want to commend Willie and Jesse for the great job that you have been doing, and also for this very wonderful presentation. I'm doing that because I believe very much in the power and the impact that investigative journalism can do. In Namibia, as I'm talking to you now, we have about two former ministers, Minister of Justice and Minister of Fisheries, who are in jail as a result of corruption, IFF, money laundering, and so on. And that could only happen because a journalist exposed that at an international level, and for that we are very, very grateful. And that is going to make an impact to our revenue collection and serve as a deterrent. There was a talk with regard to transfer pricing. Transfer pricing is a very global phenomenon, and it's something that is really challenging and very affecting a lot of developing countries' revenue mobilization capacity. You spoke about the Starbucks case. And if one look, if the UK Starbucks can get away with that in the UK, where they have more capacity on transfer pricing, you can just imagine what's happening in developing countries, because in developing countries, including in my country, you see companies sometimes operating for up to 30 years, be it in extractive industry or other natural resources, and they are forever declaring losses and not paying taxes. So it's a very serious challenge. So what I would want to encourage is that please continue doing that great job that you have been doing. But also maybe from the UN's perspective, we must still continue giving more attention to transfer pricing so that we don't just leave it at OECD. And also maybe this tax inspector without borders, if we can have more capacity there, and a lot of them really to help developing country in Africa, that will be very much appreciated. Maybe in conclusion, and my question is only, how do you deal with these challenges? Because what we see from a tax authority perspective, in all our legislation, there is always this law of confidentiality, whereby if you disclose information in line of your work, sometime in some other jurisdiction, you can go to jail as a taxman for 5 years or pay 50,000 Namibian dollar. As a result of that, we seems not to be very helpful, but we also value and appreciate your work, because when there is this exposure, sometimes it gives us leads for us to do investigation and audit, but also it also serves as a deterrence. But in your view, how can that be overcome without a taxman becoming a criminal through disclosing that which they're supposed not to do? Because you also need sometimes this information for us to be in a position to have a deterrence and for people to have to get into voluntary compliance. But other than that, keep up the great job. Your job sometimes is a very thankless job. It's just like that of a taxman. But please just know that by doing what you are doing and what you have just presented now, you just continue being of service to humanity, and that is much better fulfillment than any other amount of money. Thank you very much.
I wanted to address what you just asked, but I also did want you raised some issues that made me want to make a comment that I feel like I wanted to make a few other times here and just sort of keep losing the thread, which is, I do think a lot of you are probably coming from countries where journalists doing their job is quite dangerous, and civil servants doing their job honorably can also be dangerous. And it's sort of a reminder to me of the degree to which there are powerful journalists here in the States at mainstream publications who face no physical danger, but mostly live in fear of offending a PR person or a source. And I think that's a disgrace, and it's something that I really wish could change here, and I really wish more American journalists had that perspective on what they do and understood how much easier their job is, frankly, compared to journalists in most of the world. And the same for people in government here. they don't face any physical danger from proposing how private equity executives get taxed or how multinationals get taxed, and still they choose not to pursue that. In terms of what you're talking about, I mean, the obvious answer, which is not as simple as it sounds, but the obvious answer is just more transparency. The kind of black box that exists in terms of public information on how much taxes multinationals or individuals pay in countries around the world, there isn't really much of a justification for it. And so that obviously, things like that, I think, would in turn make life easier. I will say also, without knowing anything about how tax systems work in various countries around the world, I look at the difficulty that the IRS has in collecting taxes from high income, from high net worth individuals, from multinationals. I look at the difficulty the IRS has. I haven't the foggiest idea why these companies end up paying a dime in tax in dozens of countries around the world. Like, it strikes me that they have there's really no check on their ability realistically on their ability to shift profits out of those countries. So those are a couple of random thoughts and ideas.
My final comment on the Namibia case, or other cases, for example, is, if the French Minister of Finance can announce on Twitter 10 months or 12 months after the Panama Papers the number of individuals who've been audited as a result of that investigation, the value of fines that have been recovered, and that's all done anonymously, I fail to see why that couldn't be replicated by governments around the world. And like I mentioned before, I think that kind of public reaction to investigative journalism and to journalism on the topic of tax would really have an incredibly beneficial impact in encouraging more journalists to tell those stories. Journalists like when their stories have a visible impact in the world, and one of those impacts is asking 12 months later, what the heck happened as a result of this? So I would encourage more journalists to respond to my emails or respond to my questions when I ask, what did the Internal Revenue Authority of Zambia or of Namibia do with the Panama Papers information? I'm not asking you to disclose anything that you're not legally able to do, at least to my knowledge, but I think a more transparent dialogue around that at a global level would be really productive.
Also, there's a role for UNDP to play in terms of working with local journalists, working with local authorities, tax officials. Many of the countries we've visited and where we've done capacity building with local journalists, government doesn't want to talk to them, doesn't share information, doesn't return their phone calls. So I think professionalizing the ability of tax authorities and local UNDP offices to make sure that they're really able to work with journalists, I think will really help the situation as well, and just keeping attention on these very important problems. Jesse and Will, you've really devoted so much of your career to this subject. I think we're incredibly lucky that we have you here today. Will just came back from Australia.
Actually, can I add one other thing? One of the tricks that I've figured out is that there actually is a lot of public information out there about this, not really so much with individuals, but with multinationals, that if you can sort of figure out where to look, it's never going to tell you the whole story, but there's quite a bit out there. Like with the story I did on Google and Forrest on the double Irish and the Dutch sandwich, I had to have people explain to me what I was seeing, but ultimately the substance of the story was sort of buried in Dutch corporate filings. It was buried in Irish corporate filings. There might be a very kind of obscure reference to an entity in perhaps a US lawsuit that had nothing to do with taxes. So the reality is there actually is quite a bit of public information out there if you have the right kind of interpreter to help you figure out what you're looking at. So I think it is important. I think a great public service would be, if there's anyone here who has deep pockets and the public's interest in mind, like maybe Columbia Business School, there's a Dutch company called, I'm actually not sure if, I think they've changed owners a couple times, called Orbis, which is an absolutely incredible database for non-publicly traded companies around the world. And kind of if that database was made accessible for free to both tax administrators and NGOs and journalists around the world, I mean, that would be pretty remarkable.
Program at Columbia Business School that I went on. That's how I met Joe. I interviewed him for a homework assignment called the Knight Bagehot Fellowship, which takes mid-career business journalists and sends us to business school so we can take corporate finance and accounting. And we now have hundreds of alumni who know how to do this kind of work and often go around the world teaching it. That was one of the things that we were doing with Revenue Watch. So if UNDP or any of you want to bring over journalists to work with local journalists and accountants to do investigations and learn how to look at P&L and balance sheets. There's a lot of expertise now. When Joe and I started doing this 18 years ago, people didn't understand why. They're like, oh, what is this? This is too complicated. Why are you teaching people these things? But I saw from the Columbia program that it really works. And so there are lots of places now for journalists to learn how to do this. Although, again, working with ICIJ has turned out to be one of the most effective. Anyway, you can tell the subject we really care about. We're happy to release you for your coffee break, but thank you all for coming, and thank you for the work that you're doing, Jesse and Will.